Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 4th, as we are putting some closure onto A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I also wanted to talk about our next upcoming play a little bit, Much Ado About Nothing, and I also wanted to talk about our first paper. So let me begin with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Then we can segue into the other pieces. And as you know, last class we talked about some of the themes and ideas that Shakespeare was exploring. And this time I wanted to talk about the play in relation to its acts. And in Act 1, of course, we're introduced to the idea that midsummer is a pagan summer solstice. So that sets us up for one of the most sexually charged days and nights of the year. And that's going to be important because we're going to get lots of romantic couplings. As you know, there's been all kinds of conjecture about Shakespeare. So, something as simple as Shakespeare using pagan references has led to conjecture about his religion and whether or not he had pagan tendencies. And as we've discussed thus far, we'll never know. And in the end, it probably doesn't matter. But what we do know is that he used some literary themes and symbols that are pretty well established. And one of them is that at nighttime, we've got darkness and mystery. And the dream, I had suggested last class that love is like a dream in both its positive and negative elements. And it's something that just can't be controlled. And Athens represents our civilization and our order, and Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, represents a strong female race that has been conquered by Theseus. And the idea that she's not too happy is, I think, evidenced in the production that we saw. And because we have a comedy, we know we have to have a happy ending. So the result is that over the course of the play, the assumption is that they've reached some sort of an understanding. This kind of political union was not terribly unusual at the time period. The idea of merging kingdoms or communities, and the thought was that love would develop after marriage, or at the very least affection, not before marriage. So it's a very different conception, a different way to conceive of love. However, when we get the nobles, we get more of a romantic love, with Hermia, the short brunette, defying the conventions of beauty at the time. And I think about some of Shakespeare's sonnets talking about the dark lady. So there's some parallels here. And the dark lady in Shakespeare's sonnets is thought to be someone with dark hair and dark eyes, dark features, not necessarily dark skin. And I think you could see that in a character like Hermia as well. And she also is short. Don't think this doesn't pain me being a short brunette. You may not be able to tell I'm short in this particular video, but for those of you who've had face-to-face classes with me, you know that I am. And the reality is that I cringe always a little bit when I read this play, hearing some of the insults that are going to be thrown in Act 3, and many of them are based on physical appearance and the importance of physical appearance, especially for female, not just in our time, but also in Shakespeare's time, as we can see. And Hermia is supposed to listen to her father. She is considered his property, in effect, until she marries, and then she becomes the property of her husband. And it's also assumed that she will retain virginity until marriage, or else she would be damaged goods. Keep this in mind when we talk about Much Ado About Nothing, because there will be a connection. But nevertheless, we know that Hermia has a mind of her own, and she's decided to choose her own suitor, Lysander, even though her father insists that she choose Demetrius. Thing is, Demetrius and Lysander are pretty similar, so this seems to be more of a power play than any kind of real justification as to why Hermia's father would choose one over the other. And of course, we can think about the idea of a power play with Hippolyta and Theseus. So, how power is exerted in relationship is one of the major themes of the play. We know that the tall blonde who should have all of the attention, at least at the beginning of the play, doesn't. Helena has an unrequited love for Demetrius. Demetrius doesn't love her, but he had a relationship with her prior to the play. And that is going to be terribly important in terms of our accepting the idea that we have a happy ending, which with Shakespeare is somewhat complicated. Most things with Shakespeare are somewhat complicated because in the end, Helena will get Demetrius. But it's because Demetrius is manipulated with magic potions. So I don't know if that necessarily is a way to think of the happy ending if free will is removed, unless we want to consider that prior to the play, he had pledged himself to Helena. So this is just a restoration of order. Bonham and his cohorts, they work so wonderfully to provide comic relief, but they also represent the lower orders of the social scale because we've got multiple hierarchies here, but regardless of where couples place on that social hierarchy, they all are experiencing difficulties in love, and they all act equally ridiculous when it comes to love. One of the many messages that Shakespeare has. And they are rehearsing a play about, well, love, which is a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to make some commentary about his own play and the plays of others, as we saw and will see. And the fairies, who should be superior in terms of their status, at least superior to humans, have their own love conflicts. And they're arguing over a changeling boy. Once again, a power play. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Oberon never really indicates why he wants that boy. We can speculate, but the reality is that his wife is supposed to obey and she does not, and he's furious. So he's going to find a way to get some retribution. Of course, this can't result in death or dismemberment because we've got a comedy. We don't have a tragedy. We know that ultimately we find in the first act that love can be fickle because Demetrius once loved Helena and he doesn't anymore. And that some love is arranged. For instance, when you think about Hippolyta and Theseus, and some love is romantic in nature. Let's think about Hermia and Lysander. And all of these couples are experiencing power struggles. When we get to Act 2, we get a completely different setting. So with Athens represents civilization and order, then the forest represents that which is wild and untamed. Of course, this is where the fairies live as well. So this is how you can connect your fairies with the human world. Because Hermia and Lysander are going to run away because Hermia has been given an ultimatum that either she listens to her father's will or she's going to be put in a nunnery or she's going to be put in death. And this comes from the highest order of the land. This comes from King Theseus. And Theseus does give her time to consider, which is a very nice plot element because it allows the rest of the play to unfold. But it also, I think, makes some sense in terms of how a ruler might respond, not necessarily wanting to make a decision that would antagonize someone, hoping perhaps if some time elapsed that things might settle on their own. And also someone who's experiencing his own love difficulties because Hippolyta is not too happy necessarily, at least at the beginning, with being conquered. So perhaps he has a bit of empathy about two lovers who are also experiencing love conflicts. And they decide to run away. And of course, it turns out that Hermia tells her best friend, Helena, who ultimately tells Demetrius, which is not smart, but people oftentimes do things that are not smart when they're in love. They justify all kinds of irrationality. Demetrius, rather than being thankful and wanting to be with Helena, decides to run after Hermia. And of course, that means he's in the forest, and Helena will run after Demetrius. A very clever way to get all of our major characters into the forest, including Bonham and his cohorts, who've made the declaration that if they rehearse in the woods, they're less likely to be interrupted. And of course, we know that the conflict is going to unfold when Oberon orders Puck, maybe one of the most famous characters in the play, to use love juice on Fairy Titania because Basically, love is like a magic spell. And when we're under this magic spell, things that we used to care about, we no longer care about, such as, work, school, changeling boys. And Queen Titania does wake up and falls in love with the first thing she sees. And lo and behold, it's Bottom, who is not only at the bottom of the social scale and a complete idiot, but Puck has taken it upon himself to turn Bottom into an ass so that his physical appearance mirrors his personality. And Oberon is delighted by this turn of events, which shows his dark side. And Lysander, at this point, receives love juice from Puck because Puck has been instructed to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. This was supposed to be Demetrius, but of course Lysander is also wearing Athenian garb. Whether it's deliberate or not, we'll never know. But the reality is that Puck, acting on Oberon's orders, and we can assume that Oberon just feels a certain level of empathy for these young lovers because he has his own love issues. Now what we've got is, the beginnings of a mess that will just be further complicated when Puck is instructed to rectify his errors, which he does. And that means Demetrius has a love juice on his eyes, but so does Lysander. And now they are both in love with the tall blonde, Helena, rather than with the short brunette, which is Hermia. And what we learn in Act 2 is that love is irrational, love is humiliating, and love is like a magic spell. Act 3, and if you think about the pyramid structure, this is the height of the pyramid. This is the pinnacle, the peak. This would be the peak of conflict. And basically what we see is what I call a cat fight with best friends becoming best enemies, Helena and Hermia. And the insults fly. And I wanted to talk a little bit about language because one of the things that Shakespeare does is he illustrates good writing and bad writing. And he also illustrates how words can be used as weapons. So, for instance, it's a very simple statement at the very beginning of the play. When Hermia says in Act 1, Scene 1, around line 203 or so, Hermia is talking about running away. And she says, "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell." And the rhyme, it's simple, but it makes sense. It's a perfect opportunity to use a poetic structure to forward plot. It's quite natural. As compared to a speech that occurs shortly thereafter, Bottom, also in Act 1, this is in Scene 2, and he's rehearsing. And as he's rehearsing the Pyramus and Thisbe play, one of Bottom's speeches is, and this is around line, about 30 or so of Act 1, Scene 2. "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates." That was lofty, he says. So yes, we have rhyme, but it's absurd rhyme. He's muttering nonsense. It's so simplistic that it almost sounds like roses are red and violets are blue and sugar is sweet and so are you. Just because something rhymes, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good poetry. And the fact that he praises himself afterwards, saying that was great, that was lofty, just illustrates how Shakespeare can use good writing and bad writing side by side to illustrate characters. But as I was talking about Act 3, some of the best insults, I think, that might not necessarily even sound like an insult in contemporary times. So as Hermia and Helena, former best friends, are fighting with one another, that we learn that they use appearance as a way to insult each other. So for instance, there is a reference that Hermia is making. This is in Act 3, Scene 2, and Hermia has accused Helena of being a juggler, a canker blossom, a thief of love. She believes that basically her best friend has stolen her man. And Helena in Act 3, Scene 2, and this is around line 283 or so, responds, "Fine in faith, have you no modesty, no maiden shame, no touch of bashfulness? What, will you mar impatient answers from my gentle tongue? Fie, fie, you counterfeit, you puppet, you." And Hermia is horrified and indignant. Puppet? And that's a reference to something that's small. Even Hermia says, "Ah, why so? Ah, now I perceive she may compare between our statures, that she others her height, and with her personage, her tall personage, her height forsooth." The idea that a puppet is small. So Helena's making a height joke. And also a puppet is controlled by outside forces. And then, of course, she continues on, Hermia that is, saying, "How low am I, thou painted maypole?" So Hermia is just called Helena a painted maypole, which is a huge insult. Because if you think about May Day and the celebrations associated with May Day, such as dancing around the maypole is supposed to be a phallic symbol. And therefore, she's just called her a phallus. And worse yet, a painted one. In other words, using makeup and cosmetics to deceive. These false beauty, themes that we saw in, let's say, the sonnets that are now being illustrated in the dramas. And Hermia ends by saying, "How low am I, but that my nails can reach unto thine eyes," which is one of the reasons why I call this a cat fight. And of course, Helena responds by saying, "Oh, because she is something lower than myself, one thinks that I can match her." And again, this is all in question to the idea of height. Helena says, "Let her not hurt me. I was never cursed. I have no gift at all in shrewishness." This idea of the insults aren't just between the women, because the men who had once been completely and totally in love can now be completely and totally in hate. As we see with Lysander throwing insults at Hermia, calling her an Ethiop, which is in reference to her dark features, and again, Ethiopia. And he immediately thinks, well, shall I kill her, strike her dead? And then he says no. But his first go-to is that he's going to kill the woman that he had pledged unending love to. So that's how quickly love can turn to hate. One of the many lessons that we learn. And of course, in Act 3, if things were to come to a head, these characters would kill one another. What we learn in Act 3 is that love is filled with conflicts, it destroys friendships, and love is blind. Because we can have a fairy queen, such as Titania, fall in love with a literal and figurative ass. Again, the rhetorical question being for us, how many of us have fallen in love with an ass? You need not have to answer that question. And of course, we know we have to have resolution. When we get resolution in Act 4, the happy ending. And one of the reasons why this is a happy play is because it's been clear that both Hermia and Helena have retained their virginity throughout, even though it's set in midsummer, even though there are references to May Day. We know that when Hermia runs into the forest with Lysander, Lysander wants to lie next to her, and she tells him not to because she's afraid that temptation will overcome them. And we also know that Helena has been chasing Demetrius in the forest, and he's so angry with her behavior, he tells her that if she continues, he will do her mischief in the wood. In other words, take her virginity. So we've got basically Hermia and Lysander going to get their way. In some ways, this is incredibly progressive and subversive of Shakespeare, that a daughter can defy her father successfully. Helena and Demetrius will be back to where they were prior to the play in a relationship. And I know Helena is treated horribly in the course of the play. So is Hermia. In fact, I had a professor in college say that both men were jerks. It's just a question of who's the bigger jerk. But one of the more problematic things about Helena is how little self respect she has for herself when she says, treat me like your dog, as long as I can be in your presence. She does say something quite telling, that women were not made to woo, which is true, that she's put into the role of pursuer. And usually man should be in role of pursuer. And not only does Helena upset the expectation of the role of pursuer and gender, but she gets her way. So Helena's kind of a complicated character. In many ways, she could be seen as weak and submissive, but in other ways, she can be seen as defying stereotype and expectation, much like Hermia can. It gets more complicated when we get to the fairy world. We had such a strong fairy Titania. She had forsworn Oberon's marriage bed because they were fighting, so she refused to grant him intimacy. And the reality is that Oberon seeks retribution, and he's successful. Not only does he get the changeling boy, but he manages to humiliate his fairy queen, someone that he's supposed to love, and she forgives him after the love juice is taken from her eyes, and in theory they are going to live happily ever after. So it's a somewhat mixed conclusion, especially because Oberon is so dark. Even when Titania remembers that at one point she was in love with an ass. Maybe we could even say that Oberon in some ways is a bigger ass than Bottom ever could. And what do we learn in Act 4? Love's complicated, it's unpredictable, and it's surprising. And in Act 5, because it seems like we've got resolution, but why not have Pyramus and Thisbe performed so that we can see bad acting and bad writing and bad production values in this play within a play? A wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to criticize his competition, a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to show us a play about love that goes bad, which is what could have happened in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and a wonderful opportunity to show the lack of insight that individuals have about love, because our main characters, even though they were acting absurdly just hours previous because of love, are so entertained by the Pyramus and Thisbe play and see it as absurd and ridiculous, but never once reflect that they themselves have been absurd and ridiculous, with us ultimately having the final question raised to us that if we see Pyramus and Thisbe or A Midsummer Night's Dream as a whole as absurd and ridiculous, and we don't examine our own behavior when it comes to love relationships and conclude that we ourselves can be absurd and ridiculous, we too have learned nothing. And Puck's final apology is a wonderful way to try to rectify any kind of ruffled feathers, and there could be quite a few people that would be offended by this play. I had talked about that sexuality was much more open in terms of referencing in a play than something like politics. And that's not to say that Shakespeare didn't reference politics in his plays, he just had to do it carefully. And in this particular instance, what seems to be so very simple, for instance, Pyramus and Thisbe and the play within the play, at one point they're speaking through walls. And I'll never forget when my Shakespeare professor had first drawn our attention to this. I honestly had never really considered this as a kind of bawdy reference until ultimately it was brought to my attention in Act 5, and this is in, let's see, Act 5, I believe it's Scene 1, where what we have is the play within a play being performed, and we get first ridiculous bad poetry. So at one point, Pyramus says, "Oh, dainty duck, oh dear, thy mantle good, what, stained with blood?" So this is how somebody responds when they think they come across a dead body. "Oh, dainty duck, oh dear." But previous to this, in Act 5, Scene 1, around line 190 or so, Thisbe and Pyramus are speaking, and Thisbe says, "O wall, full often hast thou heard my moans, for parting my fair Pyramus and me. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee. And I still remember very clearly my professor basically saying that this was a reference to oral sex, that the idea of my cherry lips have kissed thy stones or testicles, thy stones with lime and hair, and this was in reference to pubic hair knit up in thee, and the idea of moans, that would be the moans of pleasure. So, of course, Shakespeare appealed to lots of different levels of audience and could easily say that there wasn't a sexual reference there. That was not necessarily his intent. But my suspicion is that people would realize that there could be a sexual intent in there and would be quite entertained. And while the higher level classes weren't supposed to be amused by that, I suspect they were. And in Act 5, Scene 1, again, something that seems so innocent, when Theseus and Hippolyta are speaking before the play, and Theseus and Hippolyta are talking about how sometimes they aren't given proper greetings from their subjects. And Theseus says that he doesn't take offense to that. In fact, he sees it as a kind of flattery if his subjects are so nervous that they can't give him a proper greeting. So this is in Act 5, Scene 1. And it's in line 86 or so where they begin having this conversation. And what he says is, the kind are we to give them thanks for nothing. Our sport shall be to take what they mistake, what poor duty cannot do noble respect. Take it in might, not merit. Where I have come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, where I have seen them shiver and look pale, make periods in the midst of sentences, throttle their practised accent in their fears, and in conclusion dumbly have broke off, not paying me a welcome. Trust me, sweet, out of this silence yet I picked a welcome. And the assumption is that the queen herself would have been seated in the audience listening to this and thinking that she is a comparable kind of ruler, that she too has enough grace to understand that if a subject is not greeting her appropriately, it's not necessarily a sign of disrespect. It could be a sign of respect because they are so nervous and anxious. So when we get to the ending of the play, and in the most famous speech, Puck says, if we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. In other words, pretend this is a dream. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. Gentles, meaning gentlemen and gentlewomen, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And as I am an honest Puck, as we talked about last class, he's not honest. And if I have unearned luck, not escape the serpent's tongue, so that's hissing, booing and hissing, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. So good night unto you all. Give me your hands if we be friends. So he's asking for applause. And Robin shall restore amends. So yes, we do have an apology at the end, but typical for Puck, it's a backhanded apology. And this is very typical of Shakespeare, where he continually complicates things. Bottom is supposed to be an idiot, and yet he says, man is but an ass. He gets it in a way that the other characters don't. So this is in direct relation to our first paper topic. This is in our syllabus and other documents folder. So you can click on that and find it. And I'm going to go through this paper topic with you. And what you will see is that I am using one of the quotes that I had initially put on our syllabus when we were talking about Shakespeare in the beginning of the semester. I suggest that you might want to take a paper copy of this paper topics handout, just so that you've got it in front of you. I've got it right here where I'm reading it to you. That both paper number 1 and number 2, number 1 will be due after spring break and number 2 will be due at the ending of the semester, are both critical papers. In other words, you don't have to consult outside resources. This is not a research paper. The idea is that you are learning how to read and interpret the literature on your own. So based on what you've learned from class and your own understanding with reading and watching the plays. And paper length, I'm suggesting 4 to 5 pages, which is a nice ballpark, but your paper should really be as long or as short as it needs to be. And the topic that I selected for you to write about is the quotation I had included in our syllabus by Alexander Angst. And he said, quote, "Don't ask for simple answers from Shakespeare. Just believe in his ability to put into one play a whole world with all of its contradictions, contrasts, and problems." And this is the quote that I would like you to examine in reference to one of the comedies. Now, we finished A Midsummer Night's Dream. We are beginning Much Ado About Nothing. And by the time we finish Much Ado About Nothing, your first paper will be due. So I'm assuming that your first paper will be about Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. That said, we've also talked about sonnets, and it is possible for you to write about the sonnets. Do understand, however, that when you're writing about short poems, that's a completely different exercise than when you're writing about a play in and of itself. But I think we saw also in the sonnets that we couldn't find simple answers, that in the sonnet, a whole world with all its contradictions, contrasts, and problems appeared. But of course, this quote that I'm referencing is in reference to the plays. And this would be the quote that you would examine for paper number 2 as well. If paper number 1 was addressing the comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, then paper number 2 would address either the history, which we would be doing after Much Ado About Nothing, that's Richard II, or the tragedies, and that happens to be, for us, Macbeth and Othello. So, same topic, different play. We are ending the semester with the play called The Tempest, which is known as a tragic comedy. It's got elements of tragedy and comedy within it. I'm listing it as an extra credit because we don't have the kind of time in the semester to talk about The Tempest in depth the way we would have with the previous plays. However, you will have the opportunity to write a paper on The Tempest if you so wanted to, and there will be an extra credit final examination question on The Tempest. And I know that it's still early in the semester, but the final examination is basically an open book, open note essay exam where I'm going to be asking a series of essay questions and asking you to respond to one. And you can reference things like class discussions and the notes from class. So if you've been reading and watching all of the plays and watching all of the videos and responding to all the discussion forum responses, then you would be well prepared for the final exam. But we'll talk a little bit more about the final as we get further on into the semester. What you should be thinking about now is the paper. So, examining the quote, "Don't ask for simple answers from Shakespeare. Just believe in his ability to put into one play a whole world with all its contradictions, contrasts, and problems." But regardless of which topic you choose, because you can create your own essay topic, but you need to have that topic approved by me beforehand, and it needs to be about one of the plays or one of the texts that we're reading in class. But regardless of what it is you write about, you have to have textual evidence and details to support your arguments. And that's something we're going to be talking about in the next several classes about how to write a college paper, which I'm hopeful is review at this point for you because you would have gone through an introductory composition class as well as an introductory literature class. But I will have a handout that I will be reviewing about writing a paper. And basically, textual evidence is using paraphrase and quotation to support your points. So quotation is exactly word for word from what is appearing in the text in the play. Paraphrase is when you put it in your own words. And basically what you're doing is much like an attorney putting together an argument. And a good attorney can argue either position of a case, guilty or innocent. And in theory, you could write two papers that contradict one another in a literature class, and both of them can be valid depending on the evidence that you are selecting and how you use that evidence to support your particular thesis. And what you are going to be pursuing, if you use the prompt that I've given you, is illustrating how either Midsummer or Much Ado About Nothing is filled with contradiction, contrast, and problems. So at the bottom of this handout, I have a little note saying a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? It's a tall order. So the sooner you start, the better off you are. And the best way to write a paper is to do it in stages rather than try to write it in one sitting. To try to generate ideas first, then organize those ideas, then ultimately draft rough sentences. Don't worry necessarily about the style or the diction. And then later you can polish it and submit it. Or, as I had a very wise professor in college once say, a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. So, handing in your particular paper. According to our syllabus, I had given a suggested date, and that's all it is a suggested date for paper number 1 for the 23rd of March. So, this would be after we return from spring break, because by that point, we should have put some closure onto both plays. Now, certainly you can hand in early papers. That's always wonderful, particularly if you know that you're going to write about A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's nothing precluding you from actually beginning that exercise now. And yes, you can hand in paper number 1 after the 23rd of March, but note that the 23rd of March puts us in week 9. So we are past the midpoint of the semester, so you really don't want to go too far past that. The good news about paper number 1, you can rewrite it for a higher grade. So once you submit it into me, I'm going to ask that you submit it via PDF to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu, because that's how my grading program works best. I will review it, return it back to you with the letter grade. If you are content with your letter grade, you are done with the assignment. But if you wanted to earn a higher grade, you can revise it. You can incorporate my suggestions into your revision. You can submit your revision, again, to me via email, via PDF, and also submit the original copy with my commentary on it, again, via email, via PDF, so I can compare and contrast the two versions, and you would get the higher of the two grades. And that's very deliberate because I see the first paper as a learning exercise. So that basically, after the first paper, you can just incorporate what you've learned from the first paper into paper number 2, which would be due by the ending of the semester, which is for us the 13th of May, but certainly I encourage early papers. So this is the time for you to start thinking about papers and what you might write and what you could write. This is the time when we will start talking about how to write a paper. And this is also the time when we are going to transition into our next play. And we'll have several classes devoted to it. And our next play is Much Ado About Nothing. You'll see that I've given you the link from the Folger Shakespeare as to where you could find that play to read. One of the things we'll talk about in terms of writing a paper is that how do you document the quote? And it's easier in Shakespeare than it is with other texts, because after a quote, you normally put parentheses, and then in the parentheses, you would normally put something like a page number. But with Shakespeare, we don't have to rely on page numbers, because Shakespearean plays are divided into act, scene, and line, much like I've been referencing throughout this class in Act 1, Scene 2, line 37, for instance. So that is the way that we would reference a Shakespearean play. But I will show you or talk more to you about that as the following classes unfold. What I wanted to do was to put closure today onto Midsummer Night's Dream, with the question for our attendance being, What did you find to be one of the most surprising things about the play? Because this really is the first play that we've addressed in its entirety over the course of the semester. So we're still novices in some respects in relation to Shakespearean plays. So, what surprised you about the play? And of course, more importantly, why were you surprised by that? That's really the key, is the why. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're encouraged, much like you would in a face to face class when we're having class discussion. What you are required to do is to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And what that will give you is an overview of some of the conversations we would have had in a face to face class. And all of that could be information that you can incorporate perhaps into a paper or perhaps even into a final examination question. And of course, as you know, our deadline, we usually have 48 hours. So that means that your discussion forum response would be due Friday, the 6th of March. But certainly, if you need additional time, let me know. I'll be happy to grant it to you. Again, what did you find to be one of the more interesting things about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? So, next class, we will talk a little bit about Much Ado About Nothing, and we will also talk about how to write papers. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye bye.